Good morning to our YouTube viewing audience and to the in-person chapel audience and to those who are listening or watching on the live stream or on campus. Today is the 27th of December 2020, the third day of the 12 days of Christmas in this bizarre year, and I guess the 6th or 7th day since the winter solstice. And it feels like winter out there. It's quite crispy cold this morning, but beautiful sunshine, and I hope that that sunshine is as much of a tonic to your souls as it is to mine. I struggle a little bit in the darkness of winter, even in ordinary years. So maybe that's a good place to start, is by nature, I believe that we are more affected by there's often debates about nature versus nurture, and I think that the nature side sometimes gets short shrift, and we like to think that we can control ourselves, our attitudes, our emotions, our intellect, and manage our lives. That we are more deeply, I believe we're more deeply subject to things like weather, climate, hunger, exhaustion, and the older I get, the more I learn this is true. Mind over matter worked better for me in my 20s, and I think I was deluded more about how effective it was. Like I would tell people I could manage various things when I probably was not doing as well as I thought. And that I was not affected. I thought I could see the world objectively. I've abandoned that view. I don't believe any of us really see the world objectively. I think we see the world through this filter that's influenced by our gender, our culture, our heritage, our history, our wounding. And part of the point of that is that in the cold months, I think there's a nut-gathering, blanket-cuddling lethargy that sort of sets in. There's part of us that remembers an ancestral heritage of hibernation that sort of makes us drag our behinds at this time of year. And something like a bright sunny day, as crisp and cold as it can be a real lift. And I think that all that gets magnified and amplified in a certain sense when you come to a place like Caron, or when you live in a year like 2020 when the pandemic is also upon us, because our general levels of stress are high, and we've been asked to kind of isolate and coop up and stay socially distant. And so there's a dark side of that too, which is this feeling of loneliness and isolation that I think attends many, and even our YouTube viewing audience is probably experiencing it out there. But for those who are patients here, and people just got through the last few days missing weirdly adapted holiday gatherings, but still feeling like they missed out. And I have deep empathy for you about that, and I seek to bring the message today that is hopefully some comfort in the middle of the darkness. But there's a summary on there. What does it say? Love is a need, a challenge, and a solution. So many years ago, a friend of mine in a study group that I was in suggested that we all take a look at a book that really kind of changed my thought and awareness on the subject of love. The book is called The General Theory of Love. It has three authors, last names Lewis, Amini, and Lannon. And this book, quite beautifully written, has a whole series of very powerful points that the writers want to make. But all those points are driven by a kind of fundamental premise that Western society in general, and American society perhaps in particular, has privileged the mind and disregarded our fundamental need for love, relationship, attachment, nurturing. And it's only in the latter part of the 20th century and now into the 21st century that many of the core disciplines that affect medicine, science, parenting, education, all sorts of areas of human life, that this awakening to our need for attachment has come back to sort of the foreground. And the truth is, in ancient societies, it was maybe all people had. So they didn't have enlightenment and rationalism and scientific method and laboratory studies and all those kinds of things. But I've always been a little bit suspicious of laboratory studies of love, because I think that love is a a very subjective and fuzzy thing. And in fact, the students of love have started realizing that it's not really good to measure love and its aspects on what they call Likert scales, like measured quantitative analyses, and more helpful to measure things like love and loneliness and emotions with story. But the bottom line of the Lewis Amini Lannan book is that we are creatures that absolutely require attachment in order to flourish and thrive. That we cannot exist alone and do well. That babies who die from sudden infant death syndrome and failure to thrive phenomena in childhood are red flags. Not that this explains every one of those instances, but red flags to circumstances of possible concern about whether there was sufficient presence. And another piece of the takeaway for me from reading about this stuff over many years is looking at our human development. And while we are not marsupials, so we're not kangaroos, and we don't birth babies and then have them in pouches that our biology provides for us, we do pretty close to that. So today, skin-to-skin contact is really important for the neonatal care, and then we swaddle our children in these little, sort of cocoon pockets. We carry them around on the front or the back, and we nurse them, we coddle them a great deal in their infancy, and that infancy extends pretty important part. I don't mean to pick on our teen and young adult patients, but actually it takes about 20 to 25 years for the human brain to develop to what they think of as sort of largely maturity. And they used to think that that was the end of brain development. Fortunately, we've learned that actually the brain can continue to be taught after around age 25, but neuroplasticity decreases as we get older. And so the point of that is, like when the 13-year-old walks to the end of the driveway and says, "I'm leaving, I've had it with you," and I don't love you and I'm going to go out on my own, they're actually completely unprepared for that. And 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds who run away tend not to do well as adults. They're a part of the population that struggles because they've missed out on important nurturing. And if you look at addicts as a large community, there are some studies that are really illuminating that correlate adverse child experiences with addiction. And if you're into statistics, you know it's dangerous to equate correlation with causation. But so it doesn't say necessarily that children who are abused or neglected or come from trauma environments or those kinds of things, that causes their addiction. But there's a very strong correlation. When you look at people who have various sorts of ailments and afflictions as adults, and you study them, they rate high on this adverse child experience scale. And so my guess is that when I'm speaking to the Caron patient community or our alumni community on YouTube, that many of us are people who suffered some unpleasant stuff early on. And that's a predictable, scientifically grounded hypothesis. It's not just a guess. And it's not just an anecdotal observance from my years in AA, although my years in AA have sort of proven the case of that. And working here at Caron, lots of adoptees, we have lots of first responders, we have lots of people from other sort of military and difficult combat experience, we have lots of people who were molested, raped, or abused, lots of people who awaken to aspects of their identity that were in tension with the culture and family norms of their location. So like I'm gay, but I can't be because I'm Jewish, like Orthodox or whatever. Those kinds of stressors are extremely common in our community. And they function in a certain sense as love wounds. So the nurturing environment in which you grew up, which should be coddling and swaddling and caring, loving, and teaching you carefully how to sort of navigate the challenges of life by essentially sometimes correcting you and then also kissing the boo-boo and making it better. All of that, if it has rough edges to it, can lead to rougher outcomes later on. But one of the really important other findings that was secondary to the adverse child experience study and the Lewis Amini Lannan research, which is also really apropos and fascinating, is that if you occasionally, we were to wander around there and go to some large population and start polling people and find people who had had a significant number of adverse child experiences and start asking them, well, do you have heart disease, high cholesterol, addiction, depression, anxiety, bipolar? These are the kinds of things that are highly correlated with these adverse child experiences. I think there are like 17 or 20 diagnoses as adults that associate with these early injuries. If we went out and found people who have those adverse child experiences but don't present with this huge list of adult challenges, and there are some people who go through really bad stuff and seem to do better than others. That always bothered me because maybe I'm just more fragile or whatever. It triggers my insecurity. I'm like, why wasn't I like able to be the tough guy who overcame everything? And but it turns out that one of the correlative characteristics of people who have less consequences from adverse child experiences is what one woman beautifully entitled the term enlightened witness. And this is the idea that that child, that infant, that young adult had at least one person in their chaotic environment who presented stability, constancy, love, rescue. Maybe it was a grandmother, or I don't know why I often think of females as aunt, but it could be a grandpa, it could be a teacher, even a therapist or whatever who was brought in the environment, but who believed in you and who said you can do this, and who you found this ability to make that like attachment to, and that holding on to that one rope of hope in the midst of your chaos helped pull you out of the disastrous sort of context. So all those I think are really important sort of background things in which for me to say a couple of like takeaways, and then talk a little bit about how we try to just meet ourselves where we are as individuals and as a community, and what we can learn from those reflections. If I had a central point I would hope that people who attended the service would take away, it's my belief that the addictive community does not quite usually realize, especially early on, that almost as a whole we are relationally compromised. We are attachment wounded. We are love hurt. And if that's big news for you, or you want to argue vociferously that you don't agree with me in your particular case, I'm thrilled for you that you don't either have those history or concerns, or what might happen is what happened for me later and for my brother. Many of us grow up in families where we like defend the integrity and perfection of our family early on in our recovery, and then later on we go to something like Breakthrough or IEP or whatever, and we start realizing, I've been telling everyone my parents are wonderful, the situation is wonderful, and I don't know, I just ended up like an alcoholic, and I can't really correlate. Like there was no problems there, So the fact that they beat me, or that that's not a big deal, or so there sometimes is a lack of awareness. But anyway, here's the point: is without being mean, I'm just trying to say this might be a work area for most of us. We could learn to do relationship better. That's what I want to say. And just not drinking will help, for sure. But as you learn to not drink and not do heroin and not do crack and not hire escorts and not, if you think about all of the different addiction interaction disorder presentations, the way they're experienced by people around us is almost as if you're cheating on the relationship. So you're going to Amazon to the one-click thing, or you're going to the sex online website, or you're going to the dope dealer, when you could be bringing yourself to us. And in the us, we could be nurturing and supporting one another and having real relationship. And for many of us, when we start to get sober, we lack those skills. That's what I'm saying. We lack competence in how to even bring ourselves to our relational frameworks and ask them to support us, because we have all of this stuff. We have automated neural pathways that tell us the answer is Johnny Walker Red, or the answer is a retail therapy thing, or the answer is baking cookies. And in fact, the answers historically for the human population was go talk to your safe person. Like, find somebody to confide in and be. One of the great toxins of the fabric of the relational network of an addict is the dishonesty of addiction. And one of the most healing ways, if you want to know how to gain relational competence, risk honesty. Like, risk truth-telling. And that will bring greater intimacy, sometimes at a huge price. Because when we tell the truth, there are consequences that come from it. But ultimately, I'd rather have a true and honest disclosure and then love after that than have somebody love me for the lie I'm telling them. Because that doesn't help me at all. If I fake you out and you love the fake Facebook image that I present, some part of me thinks, well, if you really knew the whole story, I'm not just the pretty little Christmas image that my wife and I put up to share our lovely little moment that we had the other night. There's all kinds of things underneath. So the last thing to say, and then we'll move to the other parts of the service, is that I wanted, in the midst of the darkness of winter, in the midst of the experience of Christmas in treatment and New Year's in treatment, in the midst of 2020 and pandemic, and in the midst of awakening to addiction, I wanted to ask us to think about whether we could begin to think of ourselves as enlightened witnesses to one another. That's kind of our job, and that's why one of the reasons why I think treatment really works is that it's not only the hopefully gifted clinicians that are here, but it's the love that you give one another. It's the peer community dynamic. And I have a little thought experiment that sort of proves this point, because I'm a person in long-term recovery, which I'm really grateful for. I actually got most of my recovery on the ground on the bricks in AA rather than in extended treatment. So I'm a bit of an exception, but I'm totally supportive of people like who are going to sober living and all that sort of stuff. I didn't get the opportunity to do that early in my recovery. But I remember when people would say, you know, it's the steps that get you sober. And I would have to say, well, it wasn't the steps that got me sober early on, because I didn't know how to do them properly. B, I didn't even really work them until, I started working the steps in the second and third month, but I don't think I did the best job of them until really almost my third year of sobriety, when I had a really great sponsor who took me through them in a very thorough and disciplined way, and that changed my life. But what about those first 3 years? What kept me sober? It was love. It was the love of one addict for another. It was my home group. It was my sponsors in sequence. I had several over the first couple of years. Because you kind of mature your way through different sponsors, by the way. That's a very normal thing. So who you pick as your beginning first sponsor does not necessarily have to be your sponsor. My current sponsor has been my sponsor for 20 years, which is an amazing thing, because he and I know each other so well. That's very hard for me to hide or keep secrets from him. Anyway, love one another. That's the heart of this message. And when we do that, I do believe we incarnate the divine. Like, we make, I'm a deep subscriber to the very short, one of the shortest verses in Christian scripture is God is love. It's in the first letter of John, and it's not necessarily a complete theology, but I sort of believe that the power of God's power is love, and God's love is power. And you can chew on that if you want. That's given me a lot of thought over many years. But we need a power, and we can provide that power to one another through patient listening, through honest feedback, through risking authenticity, and through modeling forgiveness, at least for one another, and as we seek to reconnect with the tribal connections that we have out in the world. So I have care for you. I hope you have care for one another, even in this difficult time of being at Caron. I'm thrilled to be with you. Let us be light in the darkness for one another.